Buongiorno and benvenuto to my patio table in northern Italy. In this video, I'm continuing the restoration of Zio Dino's 1986 Wilier Triestina Ramato road bike with the disassembly, cleaning and reassembly of this original Campagnolo Victory LX rear derailleur. The LX indicates that this is the long cage version with a max rear sprocket of 32 teeth compared to just 30 teeth for the standard version. Campagnolo described this version of Victory as one for climbing hills, city riding and pre-season training. You can see that it is absolutely disgusting, and this is even after an initial clean on the bike featured in the second video in this series. Watch the first video to see just how bad it originally was. Links down below. I've got my work cut out for me, so let's get into it. First step is to remove the gear hanger screw, which needs a 6mm hex to unscrew from the derailleur hanger on the frame, but now it just pops out of the main body. Next, it is the spring cage screw, where you need to pay attention. It takes a 5mm hex. As it unscrews, the spring tension is released and the pulley wheel cage separates from the main body. Slowly separate the pulley cage. Make sure you note which of the two holes on the front cage plate the spring is engaged with. In my case, the upper of the two. There is a ferrule and then the spring. It is still covered in lots of grease. The spring cage screw is now free to be removed. There is a small bushing attached to it that I'll separate while cleaning. Now for the easy part. The cable clamp unscrews, but the bolt doesn't look like it is removable. And back to the pulley cage. The lower pulley wheel is removed by undoing this screw with a 4mm hex. The pulley wheels, or gear rollers, are identical and have two outer bushings and a small roller in the center. The top bolt just pops out. The limit screws come out easily with a screwdriver. They have a spring below them that can be carefully twisted out. And here are all the bits and pieces cleaned and laid out. This little piece, called the upper body bush, fell out during cleaning. It acts as the B screw in this derailleur. And this little bushing, which is part of the spring cage assembly, is directional. So I should have checked its orientation during disassembly. But fortunately, I figured out how it sits, and I'll show you that later. Also, this image is available to view on my Instagram and Twitter. Links below. Now it is time for the very tricky and fiddly reassembly of this Campagnolo Victory LX rear derailleur. Start by fitting the roller screw into place on the outer cage plate. It needs to fit snugly into the hexagonal recess. Once in place, flip over the cage plate and begin assembling the upper pulley wheel. Don't worry about mixing up the two. They are identical and non-directional. Start with one bushing, open side up, the center roller, and then the pulley wheel itself. I'm adding some dry lube now as well. Finally, the second bushing, open side down. Place this to the side because we'll need it in a moment. You can already add the inner cage plate on top, as I will off camera. You can also install the lower pulley wheel now, which in retrospect may help. But it can also be done later as I did. Time to install that directional bushing I mentioned earlier. If, like me, you didn't note its orientation during disassembly, the trick is to look for wear on the inside face. In this case, there are some marks on the right hand or outer notch, which indicate that the spring was engaged there. Therefore, I'm adding the bushing so the little notch on its underside blocks the inside or left hand gap. Once it is in place, it is time to give everything a good greasing. Now begins the very fiddly bit, and apologies for the continuity errors. It took a lot of trial and error to get it right. Make sure that the short tail of the spring is engaged in the open notch of the main body. Insert the spring cage screw and bushing if it's not already in place. Insert the lower ferrule. There is a little hole for the long tail of the spring to go into. It helps to have the 5mm Allen key ready now. With the derailleur body in one hand, holding everything in place, grab the pulley cage with your other hand. I added the inner cage plate off camera. And carefully line up the protruding bit of the spring with the correct hole in the cage plate, upper one in my case, and the upper roller screw with the hole in the ferrule because it screws into the spring cage bolt. Don't worry about spring tension yet, just get all the bits engaged properly. Hold the assembly tight together. Screw the spring cage bolt onto the roller screw. This will sandwich the whole spring assembly into place. There should be no gaps. This step makes sure that the spring is properly seated. The pulley cage should now be able to rotate, but there will be no spring tension because the notch on the cage plate is on the wrong side to the notch on the derailleur body. To correct this, loosen the spring cage bolt just enough so that the cage can be rotated counterclockwise over the notch on the body. Make sure that the spring does not slip out of place. Sandwich it all together again and tighten the spring cage bolt. There should now be spring tension. The pulley cage will spring back towards the derailleur body when pulled. If not, the spring is not correctly in place. The hard bit is over. Assembling the lower pulley wheel is identical to the upper one shown earlier. I'm greasing the threads on the roller screw, but Loctite would be a better option if I had some. The fitting is a 4mm hex. Take care not to cross-thread it. Onto the limit screws. The springs go in first, and then the screws themselves. Grease the threads or use anti-seize. Now the cable clamp. Again, grease the threads, and then it's the washer first before the 8mm nut, which doesn't need to be tightened yet. On to adding the so-called upper body bush. After cleaning, I noticed a crack through the ring, but I don't think that it will affect operation of the derailleur since it is not a moving part. Anyhow, it simply inserts into the recess on the inside of the derailleur body, with the notch protruding out. This notch acts like a B-screw and sits against the side of the derailleur hanger to set the distance between the upper pulley wheel and the gear sprockets. I've arbitrarily set it to the middle position. And finally, grease up the gear hanger screw and insert it into place. It remains loose until fixed to the hanger on the frame. Now that it is all assembled, it's time to lubricate all the pivot points. For this, I'm using this cheap dry lube, mostly so I can finish it to justify buying a better one. Get plenty on the spring inside the body and wipe up any excess. And just look what a ton of cleaning has resulted in. I honestly thought the original pulley wheels had been replaced with black ones, but it was actually just grime. Unbelievable. And before I forget, this Campagnolo Victory LX rear derailleur weighs 202 grams. Next step is to get this installed on Ziodino's 1986 Wilier Triestina Ramato road bike, but that'll be the subject for the next video in this series. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Arrivederci.